in sculpture and sound and lens-based work. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, and Eliza Espy is a longtime promoter and has done a lot of work in our scene over in Pensacola over the years. And all of us are on the board of directors for the 309 Punk Museum Project. We've all been around with different bands and performed in different places and different venues and different means and mediums and done all sorts of different stuff. So, and have lived in many punk houses over the years, including the one that we're going to talk about. So I'm just going to jump into it, okay? Unless I knock all this stuff over. On June 20th, 2009, one of the sweetest people on earth killed herself. Her name was Samantha Dorsett. Samantha came into our life at 309 by way of Bloomington, Indiana. At the time, she went by Sam and was tired of her hometown. She wanted more than her small town provided, and she simply wanted to get away. In Bloomington, she helped found Planet X Records, wrote zines, worked with the Books to Prisoners Project, and was famous for all sorts of radical actions she did in the Bloomington punk scene. One even captured in a Dave Dondero song. Nonetheless, oh, he's playing tonight too. We got a little plug down there in the bottom. You know where the Orchard House is, he's here. Nonetheless, Samantha wanted to leave. She heard of a queer scene in Key West, so she bought a one-way bus ticket and headed to Florida, but was totally dismayed that there were no punks in Key West. She decided to walk home, 1,300 miles by herself. Lucky for her, and us, she was wearing a shirt for the band Discount, and just happened to be walking on the same road as several Pensacola punks, most of whom lived in the 309 Punk House. And I also like to think that this is a moment where it's always important to wear band shirts, you know, just so people will be able to recognize you. Because they're like, all right, you're one of us. The Pensacola I'm not wearing one right now. The Pensacola folks were riding on a cross-Florida bike trip, and they stopped dead in their tracks when they saw a punk. The love was instant and mutual. They brought Sam a cheap bike and rode back to Pensacola very slowly with the 309 punks. After riding 800 miles, they were home. The house they rode up to is 309 North 6th Avenue, Pensacola, Florida. If you've never been there, Pensacola is a medium-sized town simultaneously known as the Redneck Riviera and the Gay Riviera. It's known for its military presence, abortion doctor shootings, retirees, annoying tourists, and beautiful beaches. To quote Pensacola's most old school punk band, Maggot Sandwich, it's 200 city blocks of shotgun shacks along the streets. The streets look old, and they suffer from the heat. This ain't no paradise. This is the Sunshine State, my Florida. You ever heard it before? Yeah, that's Pensacola. So what's lesser known about Pensacola is its radical history. Pensacola is the home to the first attempt by Europeans to colonize what's known as the United States. In 1559, Spanish conquistadors, along with 500 Aztecs and several hundred Africans, landed in present-day Pensacola. Pensacola's radical history begins largely with the indigenous resistance movements and anti-slavery movements as they helped lead a maroon colony known as Negro Fort in nearby Apalachicola, Florida, as well as the abolitionists who started a southbound underground railroad before and during the Civil War. After the Civil War, radical reconstruction lasted longer in Pensacola than throughout the South. The city was the site of the largest industrial strike in Florida history and had a history of multiracial activism and union work predating the IWW. Though the site of at least 6 lynchings, resistance flourished in Pensacola's Black and Jewish communities. Mid to late 20th century civil rights movements, women's rights movements, gay rights movements, and anti-war movements came up in the 1960s and the 1970s, all of which dovetailed into what became Pensacola's introduction to punk, which eventually takes us to the Punk House 309. As a physical structure, 309's history began when workers built the house in 1912. The stories of the house's early history being a sort of flop house for railroad workers from the nearby L&N train depot are interesting considering 309's modern history with train hoppers from across the country, even being listed in the infamous Crew Change Guide. After having a number of owners, the house was purchased in 1987 by a married couple who worked as architects but were artists in their own right. Originally, 309 was a HUD house, a housing and urban development, if you don't know that, and had a series of people living there until the early 1990s, when a few people in Pensacola's punk scene rented rooms in the two-story, 5-bedroom house. The punks who originally rented rooms waited until a room opened, and they carefully selected the tenants. Most who eventually lived in 309, once it became a collective punk house, worked at Pensacola's main punk club, the legendary Sluggos. Rent was cheap, $385 a month in 1999, for instance, split evenly between 5 or more people, all of whom learning the ropes of dumpster diving through zines and friends allowed for a fairly utopian lifestyle to blossom at 309. This was the history which Samantha walked into in 1999 as well. Sam went back and forth between Pensacola and Bloomington, helping to establish a strong connection between the two cities. The scenes were both odd and quirky, often very political, either through protest or lifestyle, and strongly anti-capitalist as the anti-globalization movements were taking off in the years before 9/11. The residents of this punk house, including Sam, were active in all of these movements. They participated in global protests while organizing on the local level. Much of their organizing happened directly in the house, from support rallies for political prisoners to the WTO protests, the FTAA protests, IMF protests, and other international protests. After 9/11, the protests switched to anti-war, and Sam was in the streets. Meanwhile, Sam was also going through a hard time. Depression was a constant in Sam's life, as with many punks. The community we gravitate towards was a family of our own. In many ways, this family transcended punk, but was so deeply rooted in punk. Our family, the one we created, was the one who saved us. Potlucks and parties, bands, practicing all the time, forming and falling apart. We learned from each other. We tried to support each other as we all recognized the decaying society of late-stage capital. Society failed us, our families failed us, we tried to save ourselves, all we had was ourselves and our house. As 309 evolved and the country shifted further to the right, the politics became central. We wrote zines challenging the state in the days after the wars began. Thousands of them went into circulation, which is a really high number for zines. Thousands went into circulation. From the streets to the malls, our zines made an impact at a moment when people devoured news after the attacks. People came to the house, the police came to the house looking for us. They knew us by name and came in unannounced. The house had a reputation, not only with the police, but also with the punks. Often, within the scene, the critique was that the house was too insular. 309 was too hip. The people who lived in 309 were a clique. 309 was too PC, 309 was too political, 309 was a dump, 309 was paradise, 309 was legendary, 309 was too Johnny-come-lately. Whether it was the police, or the punks, or the neighbors, the house was a character in and of itself in our story. It was bigger than we were, and older than we were. Its original history was lost, but its punk history was rich. Who was the first punk to live there? How long was it a punk house? Was it really a collective house? Was it really punk? The story is 309's history. This history isn't only 309's history, though. This history is our history. Punk house to punk house, from Pensacola to Bloomington to San Francisco to LA to Chicago. 309's history is unique, but it still tells our story, and that is a story of one of resistance. As the endless wars continued, Sam protested the wars, growing a beard to stand against imperialism. Samantha wrote poems and Samantha wrote poems and zines about the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. Samantha supported prisoners by helping to revive a floundering Books to Prisoners project. Sam got involved in local politics, making the punkest flyers, challenging the homophobic superintendent of the local schools when the superintendent refused to allow gay-straight alliances in the high schools. Sam helped organize the first and only Stonewall Rebellion March in Pensacola. For much of this time, Samantha lived under my bed, literally, in the house, in the punk house that we called home. When we talk about a museum with the 309 Pensacola Punk Museum, we should explain that in many ways, this is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also very real. 309 has always been a bit of a functional museum. As soon as someone walks in the door, she's greeted by a wall of flyers, almost chronologically placed. There are some from a Green Day benefit show for a Comet Bus scene. In fact, several are drawn by Aaron Comet Bus from his days living in the house and before, including a benefit for 309's predecessor, Punk House, the Rat House, as the residents were being evicted, as you can see by their sad faces right there. I always looked at this flyer as this harbinger of doom, saying, this could be your life, you better pay the rent. Other flyers are from protests. Some are from potlucks, most are from shows, both legendary and stupid. Press packet pics, zine covers, posters, and lots of embarrassing images from Pensacola's punks. From the puke to the prom, there's an infamous wall of shame filled with school pictures, super punk pictures, baby pictures, and military photos of some of the residents. In a way, it's as if it's already been a time capsule. This is the case with most punk houses. Mostly old stuff, with a few new images to mark the presence of housemates who left some impression. We all leave our mark. The space itself is already historic. Not only is the home inside one of the most historic neighborhoods in the city, and one of the most historic cities in the country, but its punk history is clear. 309 is arguably the oldest continuously inhabited punk house in the South. It has a chapter in Abby Banks's book, Punk House, and was mentioned in a New York Times article on punk houses. The residents have contributed to the sound of modern punk, specifically the folk punk bands, This Bike is a Pipe Bomb. The house was a character in two of Aaron Comet Bus's novels, I Wish There Was Something I Could Quit, in the Spirit of St. Louis. Artist A.D. Roberson found Pensacola through the house, and photographer Mike Brody, actually A.D., she found the house. She actually hopped off a train and jumped right in front of the house and was looking for a place to get some food and shower with one of her friends, and she ended up living there. She lives here in LA now too, so you're welcome. Artist A.D. Roberson found Pensacola through the house, and photographer Mike Brody learned to hop trains outside of the front porch of 309, launching the Polaroid photographer's reluctant journey through coffee table books and shows at the Louvre. In fact, I should mention too that all the Polaroids that pop up in this show for all of us are mostly taken by Mike Brody too. So, and it's kind of cool with him is that he did us a great service, just like Abby Banks, and actually documenting what was happening. I don't know if y'all have ever had this experience, but after the shows are done, you wish that somebody had taken a picture. And Mike and Abby took a lot of really great pictures, so all the Polaroids are Mike's, most of them at least. Dozens of zines and songs were written in this house, as well as the numerous recordings by 309 residents. But the most historic aspect to the house is that it's existed, and it exists in the Deep South. Pensacola is in Florida, but it's also in the South, the Deep South, the same Deep South of racial hatred, Jim Crow, and lynching. It's also the same Deep South of radical resistance to all the above. Radical counterculture thrives in nearly every southern city. Radicals find their community, find their people, and resist wherever oppression arises. Not always, but often enough to explain why a radical history exists in Pensacola, and why Pensacola punk has existed for such a long time, at least since the 1970s, late 1970s. Through the radical counterculture, whether by immigration, or the universities, or military transplant, or organically rising up from the surf and skate culture, Pensacola's foothold, or punk's foothold in Pensacola could be explained. As the United States struggled through the Reagan 80s, Pensacola punks did too. As punk exploded in the 1990s, Pensacola's punks added their voices. Pensacola wasn't the next Seattle, the next Berkeley, or any other place, but it was a place that has remained most steady throughout the years, which is where 309 entered the picture. That's when we entered the picture. That's when Samantha entered the picture. A transgender punk woman in the Deep South needed a home. Samantha moved next door as she transitioned, but her transition was hard. I remember Samantha crying at my door one night, knocking and shaking after a pretty violent altercation she had with some rednecks. Why do they have to be like this? Why can't they leave me alone? Whether it was the rednecks or the cops, the outside hassles never really ended for her. The punks threw her a coming out party, but we could have done a lot more. She left for the Bay Area, hoping for more, but it wasn't enough to keep her on Earth. And as I mentioned, she killed herself in 2009. What punk creates is an imperfect community. Often the expectations are higher than we're capable of delivering. She came to Pensacola because she couldn't find what she needed in Bloomington. She came to 309 because there was nowhere else that she could go to. Just like a lot of us, there is nowhere else any of us could go to, and to some extent, nowhere else that we wanted to go to. But there's no perfect punk house. Just like anywhere, Pensacola's punk scene is made up of a lot of people with a few staples to keep venues or bands together. The bands come and go, the venues open and close, the zines are constantly apologizing for the distance between issues, but the scene remains the same, or at least the scene remains. What makes Pensacola, and in particular 309, unique is its remains when so many have fallen to the side. By necessity, rent in a punk house is usually very cheap. For the people living in 309, this made their somewhat ideal lives less about the daily grind and more about their projects. Out of this one house came the Prison Book Project, Open Books, Food Not Bombs, Sluggo's Vegetarian Cafe, End of the Line Vegetarian Cafe, and the Core Collective Info Shop, which is an anarchist info shop that was around for about a year or so. Writers such as Aaron Cometbus and Cindy Crabb resided in the house for some time. Painters Scott Cowgill, Sparky Taylor, Panhandle Slim, and A.D. Roberson had strong connections to the house, as did most of our former residents. The train hopping photographer, including one of our most famous former residents, the train hopping photographer Mike Brody. The house itself helped spawn what Maximum Rock and Roll once called the zine churning city by the sea, with literally dozens of zines, including Comet Bus and Doors, issues of Comet Bus and Doors, emerging from the century-old house. This doesn't even take into account the multitude of bands such as Wooden Horse, Blank Fight, with Aaron Cometbus and Cindy Crabb in there too. Dark Lion, I love that picture too. It's A.D. Roberson did that image. It's a really amazing record too. There's 8 songs on here. The whole record's 2 minutes long. 3 of them are about killing the president. 4 are about killing cops, and 1 is about killing your boss. It's like the punkest thing that ever came out. And the killing your boss one is when you're actually eating him. So anyway, I just like that record. It's worth your time to check out. And most notably, this bike is a pipe bomb, whose pioneering form of folk punk allowed Against Me to rise as one of punk's most recognizable forces in our modern era. While the connections between punk's past and present are solid in 309, this isn't terribly exceptional in and of itself. Other punk houses have similar pasts, so why would saving 309 be important? First, there's really nothing like it. Radical spaces in Chicago, New York, or the Bay Area, or here in LA are beautiful, but not necessarily rare in the big cities. Whether it's a walking tour of the Symbionese Liberation Army's history in the Bay Area, or Black Panther history in Chicago, or the anarchist history tour over here in LA, as well as punk's most famous spots here in LA, the Bay Area, and New York. This history is really important, it's really great, but it's also part of these cities respectively. And it's in some ways to be expected in a lot of these cities. Sites of resistance outside of the major cities, however, especially in the Deep South, are exceptionally rare. And to be clear, it's not that the history is rare, because the history is constant resistance all the time. It's that the continual existence of these spaces, the physical spaces, are rare. As a punk house, 309 is the rare exception that it survived through a series of near catastrophes. Not only the internal dynamics of living together with a lot of people, but deaths, as well as 2 major hurricanes, Hurricane Ivan and Hurricane Katrina, plus a number of other less memorable storms. It's seen trauma, but it's also seen a lot of joy, runaways and train hoppers looking for a safe space for the night. Older punks lived in the house when no one else would take them. Babies were even not born here, but babies lived here. That's my daughter right there, including my daughter. It's not a stretch to say that hundreds of people, including a little person, have called to this one punk house home. While not always political, resistance was cultivated within these 100-year walls. Within these walls, resistance still has the potential to be curated, so the history will continue far into the future. So why 309? As our metropolitan areas are increasingly gentrified, there is less difficulty maintaining such a project as this in Pensacola. As the rent is cheap, so is the housing. This won't last though. The neighborhood where 309 resides was once very cheap rent, working class, racially diverse, and affordable. As is the case throughout the country, this wave of gentrification is changing the area drastically. In many ways, 309 is the last house in this area that remains what it's been for decades. It's as much of a monument to gentrification as it is a bulwark against gentrification. If 309 isn't saved, it will be as if we hadn't existed at all. In many ways, this is personal. For all of us, we've either lived in 309 or been affected by the house. We've all felt its presence. Not only is this the home where my daughter spent her first night alive, but it's also the home where my best friend lived not long before she killed herself. 309 is a memorial to so many things, but memorials seemingly are antithetical to punk. For that reason, some say let it go. But what happens if we do let it go? What do we lose? We lose a house, but the larger punk community loses a long-standing site of resistance. And ultimately, we can think of the future of punk in these areas, in these smaller places, if places like this disappear. From the beginning, our goal has never been to have this as a closed, insular project, like that it's just Pensacola. If it was just about Pensacola punk, the goals would be way too provincial. From the first discussions of saving the house, the idea was that this would be a house that we all own, like all of us, everybody here participating in this conference, every punk out there in the world, that this would be all of ours. In an area of resistance, or an era of resistance, this is where we can take a stand. In the spirit of our friends who didn't make it, in the spirit of our friends who died along the way, and in the spirit of Samantha Dorset. Our goal with the 309 Punk Project is to fight gentrification by grabbing this house, saving it as an archive, keeping it as a living, breathing, functioning punk house. The function has changed, but is still a character in the story of punk. It's the story of our lives, and that's why we're doing this. Our story is rich, but it could easily be lost. Sam's story could be lost, and we can't let that happen. As with so much of our DIY culture, if we don't do it, if we don't tell our own story, who will? With institutions of higher education constantly under attack, especially where we live, we can't assume that they'll preserve our past. We hope to work together, but we also need to play an active role to save our past so that it will be useful to the future. We lost Sam, but we can't lose her story. We can't lose the stories of our friends. And this is what we're doing. We're archiving the past to help create the future. Like a lot of people in this room, punk saved our lives, and we're trying to save what made it possible by keeping it alive. This is the future of the DIY Punk Archive. Thanks.
I've heard that speech like so many times, and it still makes me feel so emotional hearing it. So the 309 Punk Museum Project Board of Directors, Valerie George, Scott Sauerwhite, and myself, Eliza Espy, formed suddenly this past fall out of necessity to respond to the demands of a new and uncharted event for all of us. After more than 30 years, our beloved punk house at 309 North 6th Avenue was going up for sale. The tragedy of the ghost ship fire in Oakland and the deep concerns felt for the safety and people living and working in DIY spaces like 309, coupled with the rapid growth and development of 309's surrounding neighborhood and the appreciation of home values, made it apparent that the decaying state of the house must at long last be dealt with. This house means something deeply personal to each of us and to many others who have been involved with it over the past 3 decades. Its absence would be palpable. The walls, which resonate with the memories of past inhabitants and their feverish efforts to make cultural and political changes through art, poetry, music, writing, cooking, activism, and general community, would be lost forever, and no one would any longer be able to visit their living memories. Art critic Lucy Lepard addresses this idea of loss in The Lore of the Local, writing, "If place is defined by memory, but no one who remembers is left to bring these memories to the surface, does a place become a non-place? What if there are people with memories, but no one to transmit them to? Are their memories invalidated by being unspoken? We decided that it was worth it to try our best to respect the validity and cultural importance of these memories, and in the process preserve space to inspire and help write the future. Rather than take on the project of renovating the 309 house themselves or risk selling to the house to someone unable to see its historical and subcultural value, the current owners generously offered us the first option to buy the house for $145,000. We have through the summer of this year to meet that goal. After having the house appraised and properly inspected, we increased our financial goal to $300,000. The monumental tasks are adding up. The house needs a new roof, all new plumbing and electrical, new floors, a mountain of carpentry work, such as repairing extensive termite damage, complete renovation of the kitchen and 2 bathrooms, foundation work, leveling the house, etc. The list goes on and on. Aaron Comma Bus and Double Deuce wrote, trying to build my dreams with what I have now, it's like building a 45-story house with 34 bricks. We, the 309 board, felt that there was a tremendous opportunity lying before us to make a claim on our own history, save the 309 house, liberate our narrative, and preserve its space. But we were starting with nothing, and the dream was so huge. We were overwhelmed, but challenge accepted. We immediately turned toward our own community, as punks do. We set up a GoFundMe and some local benefit shows. In our attempt to justify asking all of our friends, in town, nationally, and internationally, to dig deep into their own pockets and help us save the house, our vision for the future came further into focus. This story does not just belong to the 3 of us on our board and our friends that we associate the house with, but to anyone to whom 309 or punk culture has ever meant something. This house contains in its walls countless stories, so many of which will never be told. The closest we can come to the truth of this life is to preserve as many and as diverse a collection as possible, as many as want to be told. Anyone and everyone is encouraged to contribute to our living archive. We will not stop collecting and validating. Once we buy and renovate the house, we will restore its role as a residence and DIY show space, and will add to its function a living archive in Pensacola's first artist in residency program. We also have a responsibility to take an active role in writing future history, so we will rededicate community space within the house for people to share ideas and learn skills, such as recording, screen printing, and zine writing. The versatility of the house's function lies in the uniqueness of its layout, which is inviting and has nurtured and inspired so many projects, bands, zines, marches, and demonstrations. The front porch is intimate enough for morning coffee, reading, or beers and roommate hangs, and expansive enough to provide a breath of air for a crowd between sets at a house show. The front door opens into a hallway with a bedroom on the right and a staircase and a living room. The living room space is well designed for bands to play to a surprisingly large group of people. Those wishing to avoid the pit or get a better view can even pile by dozens onto the stairs, and I've seen many a brave kid dive off the stairs, over the bookcase, and into the pit. I even saw a guy's head go through a window one time that way. That probably won't be happening in the future, hopefully, but you know.
We'll get plexiglass windows.
We'll get plexiglass, that's right. Padded walls.
Sugar windows.
Yeah. The front bedroom of the bottom story is the largest room and will function as the public display of the living archive. Here, with the help of volunteers, we will have an open shop for people to see artifacts and ephemera of punk subculture, records, art, books, and zines curated from our collection, primarily local, but with enough context for our connection with the greater community. The artists in residence will also be able to display or sell things here. The second room on the first floor, beyond the stairs and a bathroom, is currently occupied by the house's only residents, Barrett Williamson and Lyric Lagos. Barrett has been active in the community for 16 years in bands such as Xerox 82 and The Hazards, and is currently the bassist and singer in Resolve. Lyric was introduced to the house by way of her first band, Altered States. They will continue to live in the house to oversee its care and effectiveness in serving the community. Barrett records prolifically and has set up a studio and practice space in the first floor's third bedroom, in the back of the house off the kitchen. Part of the funds we raise will be invested in the recording studio for public use. Moving upstairs, the front room on the second story of the house will belong to the artist in residence. The 309 board will accept applications for a rotating, constantly changing cast of characters to live for free or very cheap for a few months so that they may write, make music or art, participate in activist work, or do other work which contributes to punk culture and greater humanitarian efforts. This room is well